Welcome to Freology Friday. I'm Derrick Day, and he is.
I am Aaron Tomlinson.
Yes, you are. And in case you're wondering, I'm a little overdressed for the occasion because I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. I had the honor of officiating the funeral of my oldest friend, Leon Mims. His dad, James Mims, passed away, and we laid him to rest today. And I was honored to have been asked to officiate it, and it was wonderful. It was wonderful. It was a true celebration of a truly great man. And so anyway, that's why the you know why
Awesome.
I look so cool right now.
Right on. What are you drinking tonight?
Okay, glad you asked because I am drinking a vintner selection from the City Winery here in Nashville. My sweetheart, my fiance Maya, she a former neighbor of hers is the general manager of the City Winery here. And when she told him that we were in town, they rolled out the red carpet for us. We had a wonderful dinner, and this wine is a Cabernet
Mm,
that was aged in Kentucky whiskey barrels,
nice.
and it is absolutely fucking amazing. So
Great.
that's what I'm drinking. So I want to give a shout out to Rich Gust at the City Winery for hooking us up and taking care of us. We had an awesome time, and that's that, man.
Dude, you got me feeling like I'm ghetto tonight. I'm drinking wine. I'm
Are you
drinking wine.
drinking Thunderbird?
It is
Wild Irish
nothing.
Rose.
It is nothing nearly as fancy. I'm not dressed as well as you. So yeah, I'm feeling out of place.
Oh man, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to go full bougie on you. It's just that I just didn't change clothes. But but for
No, it's
all the
good, man.
while,
No, it's all right. It's all right. Gives me something to strive for.
listen, if you want to cash up Aaron right now, cash up Aaron, and I will take my clothes off on camera for all of
I think if you're going to do that, maybe they should cash up you.
you. So, my man, what is the topic tonight? Because I think we have a humdinger, and I'm really excited about this.
Yeah, you shot me an article earlier from I don't know what is it, verywellmind or
Yeah.
something.com,
Uh huh.
where they talk about the self from the perspective of Eastern philosophy, the perspective of Western philosophy, and then they bring neuroscience into it. And they say neuroscience supports uh, what is said in Eastern philosophy.
Yep.
So to kind of break this down, and it really is, people don't see this. If there is one major difference between Eastern religions and Western religions, and between Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy, and if there is still an Eastern way of life, because it seems like the Western way of life has kind of taken over the world,
Yeah.
but at least, you know, to some extent, Eastern way of life and thinking versus Western way of life and thinking. And the key difference between the two is on this idea of whether or not there is a self. In the West, it's about self and self empowerment,
Yep.
because philosophically, all the way back to Plato and others, you have the idea of an eternal soul, right?
Yep.
Plato believed in reincarnation or the transmigration of the soul. But the self is key. So you can bring that into, I don't know, democracy. God created all men equal, right? With the
Yep.
right to pursue as a self, your self rights. My rights are protected. That is a byproduct of the belief in the self, right?
Yep.
And in the Eastern philosophies, Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, the idea is that the self is part of, in Hinduism, what they call Maya. It's part of an illusion. It's not real. There's no self in there. It's all just programming and identification and what they call ego. And so, therefore, in the East, typically you would see less asserting of individual rights, more communal, community type of approach or thinking, And then you get into spiritual practices or spiritual beliefs. In the West, of course, the belief that God saves your soul, that you live eternally in heaven. Whereas in the East, there is no self to preserve. And the goal is to get out of the self. And if you get out of the self and discover there is no self, then basically you can get off the wheel of reincarnation and quit having to come back here. And it's a drop of water returning to the ocean kind of idea. So that's how I'll set that up, Derrick. What do you Oh, wait, the neuroscience part. So what this article is saying is that they've mapped all the parts of the brain and their functions, which I don't believe is true. Just as a side note from my own study of neuroscience, I don't believe that's accurate. But let's suppose it is. The writer of the article saying neuroscience has mapped where all this stuff takes place, including the concept of a self, which they say in the article is a left brain function. And they haven't been able to find a center in the brain that matches or corresponds with a self. So they look at the brain and say, there is no self in there. We can find all these other functions that we do: memory, language, learning, perception, all that stuff, emoting, but we can't find a place for self. So, although they kind of contradict themselves because they said self existed in the left side of the brain from the narratives that we tell ourselves. So anyway, I'll bat it back to you with that.
No, I'm looking at this at the article, and it says that neuroscientists they made the claim that the self resides in this in this neural location, but there's no agreement in the scientific community about where to find it.
Right.
And so there's a question that's posed in here. It says, why are you unhappy? Because 99.9% of everything you think and of everything you do is for yourself, and there isn't one. Now, here's the thing that I want to get to is that I did a whole master class on self and why self-awareness, self-love, self-actualization, self-realization, why all of these things are so important to living a successful life. But reading this, I'm like, okay, should we simply disabuse ourselves of the notion of self in order to achieve happiness? Or is there really a self? And this is my conclusion, just to kind of get to the end before the begin, or get to the end of the beginning, is that I completely adhere to the concept of self. But reading this article was a revelation to me, and that's why I shared it with you, because it makes the case of no self. And this is actually a very interesting concept, because like what if the key to happiness is utter selflessness? And I think that's kind of where this is going, because the Eastern religions, as you mentioned, are selfless. That self is not understanding self is not the key to ultimate happiness, to ultimate fulfillment, but it's emptying yourself of the notion of a self. And so I was looking at this and said, like, okay, and I'm reading from the article. It says your illusionary self, the voice in your head, is very convincing. It narrates the world, determines your beliefs, replays your memories, identifies with your physical body, manufactures your projections of what might happen in the future, and creates your judgments about the past. And I'm like, okay, so on the one hand, it's saying that self kind of dictates our perception, right? But the Eastern notion is like that. Okay, so the difference between the Eastern spiritual traditions and psychology is that the former recognized that this experientially, and the latter did so experimentally. And
Right.
so it says, in the view of the author here, it says this means that those who study and teach psychology are still largely unable to appreciate the implication of these findings. So what I'm seeing is that on the one hand, I mean, because this is something you and I have talked about before, right?
Mhm.
We've talked about this privately and publicly, and whether or not, what is the importance of self. And so we have said, okay, that part of the reason why people feel unhappy or unfulfilled is because they don't have a healthy perception of self. But if we take what's gleaned from this article, is that it's not elevating the sense of self, but rather deprecating it. And that,
Mhm.
and that just really, I really enjoyed the article because it stood a lot of what I believe on its head.
Yep. Yeah, I get that. That makes sense. So it's very objective of you, Derek. The reason I'm saying that laughing is because I have a very strong bias on this issue. I have a very strong opinion and a very strong bias. So I'll just, admit that from the very beginning. I've thought a lot about this, being a therapist, helping people, being interested in neuroscience, degrees in psychology, and then also some of the stuff I've done with spirituality. And so I've thought a lot about this, and I have some really, I think, very valid reasons for why I don't think I like this approach. I have a visceral reaction to it, to be honest.
Okay.
So I'll just throw out some of the thoughts that I've had, and we can discuss them or whatever. But first of all, if I understand right, and I just perused the article because I'd read it before actually, so I didn't spend a lot of time with it today. But you got it in front of you there, so correct me if I'm wrong. But I think you said, in the article, the idea is that what makes us unhappy is the narratives and the stories and the things that we tell ourselves, which only have existence inside our brain.
Right.
Absolutely
Yep.
agree with that. And so therefore, the key to happiness is the diminishing of the self. But here's some problems I see with that. First of all, there are certain things that just talking about the brain, there are certain things that you can't not do. So, for example, you can't just wake up tomorrow and decide that you want to forget the English language.
Mhm. Okay.
Let's say you hate the English language.
Yeah.
Let's say you want to learn something else. You can't make yourself forget English.
Right.
You can't make yourself forget how to drive a car. You can't make yourself, you see what I'm saying?
Yep.
Like you're going to do it regardless. And that's how this feels to me. Like you're going to tell a story regardless, even if your story is, I reached the Atman state, the state of no self, the state of selflessness. And here I am now with no attachments and I'm in bliss, or I'm in the process of letting go of these things. That's still a story. That's still a narrative. That's still a sense of self. My sense of self is just that now I'm more selfless.
Yep.
But they're saying there is no self. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
So you can't get away from it. So pragmatically, practically, that makes no sense. Now, you can absolutely don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We do identify with stories that are negative for us. We do have a talking head or voices or many different parts and aspects that tell us many different stories. And that can absolutely lead you to depression, anxiety, all that kind of stuff, right? And you
Yep.
don't want to identify with those. You do want to realize that is all just bullshit that you're making up in your head. But in my opinion, it needs to be replaced then with something that's healthier. You see what I'm saying?
Okay. So
that's,
what would be the something healthier? That's
what's that?
what would be the something healthier? Because that's the $1 million question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's where you get into, a lot of what we do in therapy is called reframing. I had a conversation with a friend this week, and I don't want to go too much into it, but I was discussing a victim villain story I was telling myself. And, we never make ourselves the villain usually. Sometimes we do, but in this particular story narration, I was telling myself I was the victim. And he just said something in passing to me that completely shifted it for me. Like, actually, if you look at it from this perspective, you're not the villain at all, basically. And that's all I needed. Like, it was funny to me because I thought, I'll sit with people in therapy or do, YouTube videos or something. You sit there and you think you have to persuade somebody of something, but a lot of really cool stuff happens just in conversation when you really listen, and people are able to reframe stuff for you. So I was able to let go of that story and tell myself a different story that made me feel much more empowered and better about the situation than I was feeling before that conversation. And I guarantee you that my friend has no idea how much he helped me just sitting down over lunch. You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
But here's the other thing I would say. If we accept the concept that we have no story, that we have no narrative, that we diminish the self or we live selfless, how does that work in real life? How does that work in relationships? How does that work on the job? How does that work for things that we've talked about, like goal setting?
Mm.
I don't understand how that works. So that's some of my pushback on the article.
No, and I completely get that because, on the one hand, we talk about, okay, self actualization, self realization, and we know, so clinically we
Hmm.
know that there are some results, some
Hmm.
measurable, tangible results that we can get from better understanding of ourselves. But what is the result?
Hmm.
What is the end game of disabusing yourself of the notion of self?
Hmm.
What happens? So, in other words, does this make you a better person? Does this improve your relationships? Does this help you with goal setting? Or does it create this sort of intellectual relativism, right? In other words, that there is no concrete, but everything is abstract.
Hmm.
And so that's what I was taking from this, because I get this. I get what the authors are saying,
Hmm.
and I understand the Eastern perspective. I get all of that, but the question that I have is, what's the end game?
Hmm.
If I were to say, okay, let's just say I engaged in this thought experiment of completely emptying myself of self,
Hmm.
and saying that what I understand to be real, what I understand to be true,
Yeah.
that this is all relative, and
Right.
that it is it's okay, it's a collective rather than an individual experience. So in other words, now what you're saying is that myself is really just an expression of a broader consciousness.
Hmm.
What does that mean? What does that mean to the individual? And again, we've talked about like ego, and how a lot of people say, okay, if you're going to have a healthy life, you got to dispense yourself of the notion of ego. And so you and I both said that, okay, the ego at a certain level is essential to understanding self. But if I say I'm disabusing myself of the notion of self, now I'm exercising the ego. And what are the ramifications of that? And so basically this article represents a low-key existential crisis for me.
Yeah, no, I get it. But like, here's again, and again, I'm very biased in this arena. Um, but we can't even talk about it without, I'm going to divest myself of self. Well, who's the I that's doing the divesting? There's still a self there.
Good point.
So we
Good
can't even we
point.
can't even linguistically talk about it in a way that makes sense. You see what I'm saying?
Yep. Because
But
if you're going to divest yourself of something, who's doing the divestiture?
exactly. So you're still back to a self. It's just a different self.
Yeah. Wow. That helps me out a lot, because again, when I was reading the article, I said, okay, this is really interesting. But so let me just say this, right? Speaking in a very subjective tone, I like myself.
Hmm.
I'm happy with myself.
Hmm.
Myself produces a center of joy, a center of being. So if I'm divesting myself of that, am I divesting myself of that which brings me joy?
From
And
a
that, yeah.
Go ahead, sorry. From a
No, no,
Buddhist perspective, absolutely, because from a Buddhist perspective, desire is the root of all evil.
no. Ooh.
So you're attached to what brings you joy. You're attached to what makes you happy, and eventually that's going to pass, and you're going to suffer. So the key is lose your attachments to everything that you desire. But here's the problem that I see that we do in the West, and this drives me nuts. And and this is why I don't talk a lot about Eastern religions. And when I do talk about Eastern religions, people tell me I don't understand them, even though I did take 2 higher level college courses. Actually, my minor was in comparative religion, so
Okay.
I do have some higher education. Like, I'm not an idiot when it comes to this
Right.
stuff. Um, but what we do is we take Eastern ideas, but they're completely divorced from the soil of the Eastern religion out of which it sprouted. So that would be like taking, I don't know, principles of forgiveness. That's not even a good one necessarily. I'm trying to think of a Western comparison, but taking some principle from Christianity and trying to apply it without all the philosophical underpinning that Christianity has for why that thing should be true. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
So from an Eastern perspective, and I get it. Like, think about how bad life sucks if you're poor. Think about how bad life sucked 100 years ago. I was just looking at lifespans out of curiosity this week, and I mean, like, it wasn't much past 20 for most of human existence,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
So life kind of sucked, right? So the idea is, in Christianity, I need to have my soul saved. I need to believe in Jesus so that I can get out of here and get to heaven, right?
Right.
In the East, the idea is this world sucks. We're already in hell. There is no hell to go to. We're already in hell.
Already in it. Yep.
And we keep recycling and reincarnating. And why do we keep recycling and reincarnating? Because we have desires that attach us to this physical realm. So if we still have a desire for sex, if we still have a desire for food, if we still have a desire to be loved, whatever that is, that attachment keeps us on that cycle of death and rebirth, and we have to keep coming back into hell. So therefore, we're going to develop meditative practices that empower us to let go of all that stuff so that eventually we get off the wheel of life. So it's no different than praying the sinner's prayer. But we detach that from its original purpose and its original philosophical context, and then we try to bring it over into Western thinking. And I just don't think it works. I don't think it's healthy. I don't think it's good. That's just me.
Yeah. And so I'm looking at the article again. It says over the last 40 years, several additional studies have shown that the left side of the brain excels at creating an explanation for what's going on, even if it isn't correct, even in people with normal brain functioning. For example, all things being equal, we prefer what's on the right side, but almost no one is aware of this. So researchers presented participants without previous brain injury with 3 almost identical items and asked which they preferred. There was an obvious right preference, but when asked why, they made up a totally incorrect story, such as I just like the color more. Here's the thing, right? Are we creating a narrative based on an inherent bias, or or is there some empirical reason why we have a preference, right? So it
Mhm.
said even when the researchers told them of the idea of the study, the left brain of participants couldn't help but believe the stories that it created. So in other words, now again, what they're saying in the article, that the left brain will lie to you,
Mhm.
and that hang on for just a second. Oh no,
Mhm.
never mind. You had a key. I thought you were knocking. I'm sorry.
No.
May had stepped out, and I thought she was knocking to get back in, but she had a key.
Yeah,
Okay.
you don't want to leave her out. No.
No, no, not at all. She's my glass angel, so I have to protect her from all things. So, but again, um, so this creates a really interesting question. It creates a quandary, right? So we see now in 2024 people who are willing to believe a lie rather than accept the truth, and basically it's they just are willing to accept
Mhm,
what's being presented even though there is evidence to the contrary.
mhm,
So this really, I mean, and again, this was one of these things that it literally created an existential crisis for me because it was like, okay, I'm all about self. I'm trying to help people understand their self, their best authentic self, and we've talked about that, and how to operate within that, right? But then you have authors such as these saying, okay, the Western view of self is something that's not tenable, and that we really have no self, and the reason why we're unhappy is because we're trying to connect to the self that is non-existent. We're trying to connect to something that's non-existent, and so I'm going to say this, and I'll kick it back to you.
sure.
That okay, so let's say that we become connected to something non-existent,
Hmm.
and this is, so watch this.
Hmm.
This is the mystique of religion,
Hmm.
because you're connected to something that you basically, by every known metric that you could produce, you know that this isn't true.
Hmm.
But you say, okay, I'm going to hold on to this because I like this interpretation more.
Yeah, I totally see what you're saying. And again, there's some benefit. I would say, for me, the benefit is in realizing that the self is very reformatable.
Yeah.
It can be very reformatted because it is an abstraction. And I think then the question becomes, when we're talking about this, does it have an existence? What do we mean by existence?
Ah.
Um, because if we mean existence in a material sense, then no, there is no self there, because I can't pull it out and show it to you. You can't touch it. You can't, you know what I'm saying? It doesn't have
Yeah.
a physical, it doesn't have physical, it's not concrete. It doesn't have physical characteristics to it.
Yeah.
But neither did the dream that I had last night, you know?
Okay. So this goes to something that I've always talked about. I said, okay, is it tangible, measurable, or repeatable? And
Right.
and so what you're saying, Aaron, is that it's none of those.
Right. I mean, so if I had a dream last night, it was very real to me.
Yeah.
Does that dream have no existence? Does that mean I didn't dream? I mean, you see where I get hung up on this
Yeah.
stuff?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so again, I just find the language, the way we talk about this stuff, very problematic. I think for me, what I would say the self is more of a container of information. And it's either information that empowers us or it's information that disempowers us.
Hmm.
And we're so wired in the West, and maybe it's this way in these two, I don't know, but we're so wired in the West to find out what's true, to find out what's real. I mean, in Christianity, you have to believe the truth. That's why there's 30,000 denominations, right? And then which way do
Right.
you get into heaven? Like I was so early on as a Christian, I was so worried about that stuff. I said the sinner's prayer every way it could be said. I was sprinkled as a Methodist. I went and made sure I got dunked as a
As a
as
Baptist.
a precaution, you know what I mean? And then
Yeah. Yeah.
somebody told me, "Oh, you went in backwards. You can't." I mean, this is real. You went in backwards. You got to go in forwards because you don't fall back into the kingdom.
Yeah.
I mean, you know what I'm saying? And so it's like we got to figure out the thing. We got to figure out what the truth is. And when maybe the truth is, a lot of it's just relative.
Hmm.
right? Like the time zones. What time it is here is not the time that it is there in Nashville. It's just
Right.
not.
Right.
But I'd be lying if I said it's 6:30.
Yeah. Well,
You see what I'm saying? So
it's
instead of asking ourselves the question,
no,
is
but
real?
hang
Is
on, hang
true?
on.
Yeah,
If you said it's 6:30, that is true in some part of the world.
right. But it's not true here. So
It's not true there. Right.
if my wife said, "What time is it?" and I said 6:30, I'd be lying.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, and I guess what I'm saying is that there can be multiple things true at the same time, and we try to narrow down in sort of a bifurcating fashion. This is true. This isn't true, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Um, if this is true, all these other things can't be true. And so I started asking myself a different question about beliefs and stories and narratives and the values and the way I present myself. Is this serving me? Is this empowering me? Is this resourceful for me? Or is this working against me? Am I in my own way? Is this disempowering me? Is this preventing me from wanting to get up in the morning instead of giving me a reason to want to get up in the morning? You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
And then evaluate those aspects of self under that lens, and then work to either rid myself or transform that which is unresourceful
Mm-hmm.
and strengthen and multiply that which is resourceful. And so, from that perspective, I think it's very, very healthy to realize that there is no concrete reality to self, that it is very plastic in that sense. It's very
Yep.
moldable, it's very shapeable. And one of the things that we get to do as human beings is, instead of, is to be able to create, if we want, a different version of ourselves.
Yeah.
But to go with no version of self, I just don't see how that works.
You know what? I just thought about something, right? Because we talked about this in quantum physics, right? We know that in quantum physics, the observation changes the outcome, right?
Right.
So you and I can perceive the same quantum phenomenon, and the behavior, the outcome of the quantum phenomenon is different based on our observation. So why then does something like a television exist, right? Well, the television exists because a wave function collapses, and this is what I think. This is my hypothesis, right? That everything exists as a wave until it doesn't, right? In other words, that at some point the wave function collapses and produces a particle. It produces something that's tangible. So when we talk about self, let's say that there is no self, that there's a universal consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that universal consciousness represents a wave.
Mm-hmm.
And that wave exists until it doesn't. Now the wave function collapses and produces a particle. Now it's something that it's tangible, that it's measurable, that it's repeatable, right? So this whole concept of self, I think that basically I think that here's the harmonization of the two disparate parts of this article,
Mm-hmm.
is that the Eastern premise is that there is no self.
Mm-hmm.
That's a wave, right? That
Mm-hmm.
there is this global energy field that simply exists and is universal.
Mm-hmm.
But that wave collapses, that wave function collapses into a particle,
Mm-hmm.
and that particle becomes something, whether it becomes a physical thing like a television, or whether it becomes a physical thing, or let me say, not so much a physical thing, but an experiential thing such as self,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the wave function now collapses, and it produces self as an outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And this was this is one of these things. Okay, so I'm reading the article, and then as we're talking, I'm having this thought, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, if I'm looking for a localized harmonization of this, right? Because we've talked about this, and we agree that there is a self, that there is an ego, that there is an id, that part of us exists, and it is a prime mover of everything that we are, right? So to say that that doesn't exist, I think is a little bit disingenuous unless you say that self doesn't exist until that function collapses into something that's agreed upon. So I think that what happens is the reason why I'm able to perceive you as Aaron is because the wave function of consciousness has collapsed into a localized thing that I can perceive to be Aaron.
Hmm. I love that illustration. I think
Yeah.
it's a beautiful illustration and way of looking at consciousness and individuated consciousness,
Yeah.
for sure. I just, randomly off the top of my head. And again, I really want to affirm that, Derrick. I mean, like that was just so well illustrated that I can't really add to that. But again, how does this work in relation? Well, it's two ways. How does this work? So if there is no self, I'll throw this one out you, and then I'll talk about relationships quickly. But if there is no self, there's no self to defend. There's no identity to defend.
Right.
How does that change social justice issues?
And that's a really good question because if there is no self to defend, then there is no practical application of social justice.
Right.
That basically it is whatever happens happens. And so we just let things be. Now, granted, for those who are opposed to social justice as a construct, that might be a perfectly plausible explanation. But we do know that there are things that happen that are unjust, that are unfair, right? And if we say, okay, in order to realize, that is to make real this notion of social justice, that there has to be an experiential end of this, which means that there has to be a self, because the self is what is doing the experiencing,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if you take away self and you say that there is nothing to experience injustice, inequality, okay, then that means that social injustice, inequity, disenfranchisement that can continue on
Mm-hmm.
without any interruption, because there's no self to be interrupted by that.
Right.
There's no self to be disrupted by that. And so to what you're saying, I would contend with that, because if that's the operating premise, then that means that there is no harm that can be done to anyone.
Exactly. And doesn't that sound like something religion would do?
It absolutely does.
to bolster the power of the power brokers?
Ah.
I mean,
Dude,
it's not just in the West where religion was oppressive and used as a tool to enslave people.
right. I mean, religion has been this tool throughout humanity in a universal sense.
Mhm.
Because even Eastern religion, like let's look at Hinduism as an example, because Hinduism is pantheistic, polytheistic, right? And that you have many gods that produce many results, but there are people that stratify into these different castes, right? And so irrespective of the religion, irrespective of the belief, that you fall into one of these silos.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're either, like, let's say, a Brahmin who's at the top of the food chain in a Hindu caste system, or you have the untouchables, which are at the absolute bottom
Mm-hmm.
of,
Right.
of the Hindu caste system. And so if you say that there is no self, right, then what is it then that dictates what is a Brahmin and and dictates what's an untouchable? And so again, when we talk about bifurcating this between Eastern and Western. Hinduism is a distinctly Eastern religious paradigm. So what you're saying is that, well, let me say this: are you saying that there is no self? And if you're saying that there is no self, then that means you disrupt the whole caste system, and you destroy that. And that also means, from a Christian standpoint, right? The believers versus the non-believers, the heaven bound versus the hell bound. You disrupt that. And that's, so on the one hand, I see an equity that comes from that. But at the same time, I also see an inequity that stems from that. And it's, man, whew.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I would argue that that belief of no self is used to strengthen the social order, to keep people from asserting or wanting a better life for themselves, because there is no self there.
Yeah.
And I'm going to guess the people at the top of the food chain don't think about, well, there is no self, so I'm not that great. Like, I'm just going to guess they don't touch that
But
stuff.
watch this: Christianity, in particular, what does it say? Deny yourself.
You're right.
Deny yourself.
Mhm.
And that fits in this narrative of what the authors of this article are saying, that there is no self.
Right.
But if there is no self, what is it that's driving you? This is getting back to your point. If you say there is no self, what is driving you to disabuse yourself of self?
Right. There's an I in there that wants to be happy. And that
Right.
I is being told, if you just pretend there is no I, then you'll be happy.
But there has to be an I to deny the I.
Right. Right. So, and I saw this, Derrick, I mean, the biggest pushback that I saw during 2020 with Black Lives Matter and the whole, George Floyd thing and the way that thing erupted was because, back then I was very vocally very supportive of all of that.
And those of you who are on the melanated side of things, we sure appreciate you.
Yeah. And, but the biggest pushback that I got in my inbox or on my Facebook page was from people who have imported this idea that there is no self for exactly the reason I'm mentioning.
Yeah.
Because if there's no self, there is no opinion to have. There is no, you see what I'm saying? Like, it's used as a means of gaslighting.
Right. But
And
here's the thing. Those same people, they're okay with the concept of no self until they're not.
right. Because you can't not do it. A lot of this stuff came into Western culture through the work of Eckhart Tolle, right?
Yep. Yep.
The Power of Now, There's a New World Coming, or whatever it was called.
Yep.
So I read Tolle's work back in 2003. And I was so blown away by it that I preached for 2 years concepts from that book. I would read the book, and I would
Yep.
find stories in the Bible that matched what he was teaching, and I would teach it.
Okay.
That's how committed I was to it, until I wasn't, because I realized this stuff does not work on a practical level. It sounds great.
Yeah.
It sounds really like it's an answer. It sounds like it makes sense. But at the end of the day, you can't not have a sense of self. You can't do it.
Right.
Your brain is your self, whatever consciousness is in this form that we experience as human beings.
Yep.
You're always going to have a sense of self, and you have to have a sense of self in order to be healthy and have healthy interactions with others. Because if you don't have a sense of self, then Derrick, you don't have a sense of self, and we're just one. And so really it doesn't give a fuck what happens to you.
Right.
It doesn't matter. You see what I'm saying? But let's take it deeper. How do we relate then to other people? Because there's no self to know.
See, and that's the part that's the part that I disagree with. And let me explain why.
Yeah, please.
Because if I'm going to relate to you, Aaron,
Hmm.
right? In order for me to relate to you, I have to recognize your being,
Right.
right? I have to recognize your sense of self. And I have to have empathy for and compassion about your being. Because if I don't, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say things and do things that are going to be abusive or
Right.
harmful to you,
Right.
right? So in order for me to have empathy and compassion for you, I have to first sense, what does that mean if it's happening to me?
Yeah, no, I understand that.
Yeah,
And that's all predicated on having a sense of self. That's exactly what I'm trying to say. You just said it
exactly.
better than I did.
No, I mean,
No, 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 really.
I'm totally on board with you. You know, and again, I'm reading this article, and like I said, it produced a momentary existential crisis because
Sure.
I'm like, okay, what if there is no self? What if the key to happiness is just simply disabusing myself of this whole concept of self, and I'm part of this global consciousness, but the problem is that, okay, so I think in terms of quantum physics. This is like my paradigm, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, why do I exist? Why do I exist? I am a wave. I am an energy form, an energy being, but I have a locus. I have a manifestation. So that means that in order for me to have a locus and a manifestation, then that means I must exist in a particular way.
Right.
And the only way for me to exist in a particular way is that some wave function that is around me collapses to produce me at a particular vector, that I exist at point XY, right? So all of us, we are part of this. So you and I, we've talked about consciousness, right? And so I'm thinking that consciousness is sentient, that it's sentient energy. But at a certain point, that sentient energy collapses. The wave function of that collapses into something that where there is a locus and a manifestation. In other words, we become particular. And I love this because if you go back and look at the Bible, right? What are we? A peculiar people. And peculiar is particular. That in other words, there is a locus, that there is a definable manifestation, an existential point where we actually
Yeah.
occupy the space.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a brilliant explanation of it. And again, I love how you laid it out with the ethics and the empathy and stuff like that, because none of that becomes possible if there's no self
Right.
and or falling in love.
Come on, man. Preach.
Who did you fall in love with if there's no one there? Did you just fall in love with programmings and bullshit in the head? I mean, because then basically to say people I love, well, you don't really exist. It's just that's just bullshit you believe in your head, and the best way to be happy is realize it's bullshit. Well, then how did you find out? Like, what is it? What are the aspects of this person that I love? Could be their
Yeah.
sense of humor, could be their, who knows? I mean,
But,
there's a
but,
long.
but, but again, can you, okay, so let's talk about this because you've mentioned falling in love, right?
Mhm,
So let's say that we are part of this global consciousness, right?
mhm.
Can I fall in love without a locus?
Who's there to fall in love if there's no love?
Exactly. Exactly. That this
You
way.
can't have a relationship. You
Exactly.
can't have a relationship at all
Right.
with
So
anybody.
so 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 watch this. When we talk about relationships mathematically, right? A relationship mathematically says that you have a convergence at two coordinate points, right? Or multiple, or if you look at it three dimensionally, that you have multiple coordinates at which this occurs, right? So that means there's a point, right? That means that that it has ceased to become a wave, and has now become a particle. It's become something that has a locus, that has a definable velocity, volume, or whatever, right? And that's so perfect illustration, Aaron. Perfect illustration. If you're talking about falling in love, I can't fall in love with a wave function.
Right.
The wave function is global. There's no locus, there's no focus.
Right. There's no coordinates, so therefore there can be no relationship.
God damn, this is good, man.
I think about it this way too. My body is a whole, but it's made up of, I don't know how many millions, billions, trillions of cells. I don't know.
Yep.
That work together, that work in harmony. In other words, they're in right relationship. So to be healthy is for all of these parts to be doing their part to be in right relationship with the whole. And so I think about consciousness and in this same kind of way. Now, if I have cells that get out of harmony, if I get cells that think they're it becomes cancer.
Man, you took the thought right out of my head. I was saying you're describing cancer.
Yeah. So I do believe in oneness, but I also believe in individuated consciousness.
Yeah.
We're all one thing and that we're all part of this global consciousness. But for whatever reason, this global consciousness is coordinated in points of consciousness, just like cells are coordinated in the body, and they have to have healthy relationships for the whole body to be healthy. If I cut off my finger, I can't pretend that those cells didn't exist.
Right.
They're not there anymore.
Yeah.
I'm going to be handicapped in that sense. Even though I know handicapped isn't a...
Well, no, handicap is perfect in this context. So let me say this, right? I wrote an article, I wrote a blog post this week about soulmates, right?
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yeah.
and I used to believe this whole thing that, okay, there are no such thing as soulmates, right? That all of us have the potential to be something to someone. But what I've discovered, I mean, in the last 4 or 5 months, right, that that a soulmate is actually a real thing. You know, that there is this person. There is basically this person has collapsed their wave function to something that is quantumly entangled with or quantumly attracted to your wave function has collapsed into a thing. And so now you have these two particles, these two particulate things that now share a similar energy field and are quantumly entangled. So what impacts one impacts the other, and that is if you look at the dictionary definition of a soulmate, that fits.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I think about, okay, self, I cannot experience a soulmate without first experiencing self. Because if I'm not experiencing self, then that means that this energy that has collapsed into the wave function of that has collapsed into something that is compatible with or edifying to me. If I don't understand myself, if I haven't determined my own locus and my own value, my own XY coordinates, right, then how will I know that this is actually anything how will I know that this is love?
Right. And you can't have boundaries either.
Yeah.
And that's where it these groups, they become abusive. They become cultish because there is no boundary. If there's no self, there's no boundary. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I can tell people at work, like, I just simple, very, very simple. I've been through 3 bosses in the time that I've been at the college. I told every single one of them, I will not be micromanaged. Yeah. I don't work well being micromanaged. So we're just taking that off the table right now.
Yeah.
And 2 out of the 3 bosses tried to micromanage me. And it was difficult because I would do little passive aggressive stuff to set a boundary. Now, here's the thing. I do a good job. I get good results. I get all my work done, but I'm not going to be in at 7:55
Yeah.
if I have to clock in at 8. I might be there at 8:15. I don't have a client at 8. If I have a client at 8, I'll be there at 7:55. But I never had clients at 8 o'clock in the morning. Never. They didn't schedule them.
Yep.
So I might be there at 8:15. And I would have bosses that would, no, you got to be sitting at your desk like you're in a fucking assembly line at a factory. You got to be sitting at your desk at 7:55, or ready to type at 8 o'clock. Well, I've got nothing to type. My work is done.
Yeah.
So I would tell them, I will do a good job for you. I will make you look good. Don't micromanage me.
Don't micromanage. Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? But if I don't know that about myself, then I'm going to be up at night. Oh my God, I better make sure I'm there at 8 o'clock, right? If I didn't know what I was good at, this is where it doesn't work practically in the real world. If I didn't know what I was good at, how would I know what job to apply to?
Yep. That's exactly right. And here's the thing that if we don't have so let me say this, that I think that what people do is they try to violate the laws of physics, right? And they'll say, okay, I am part of this global consciousness. Or cogito, what is it? Cogito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am, right? So you think that you're part of this global energy, but you don't allow your wave function to collapse into something that is perceptible. And so I've asked my soulmate to come over here for just a moment.
Mm-hmm.
I asked her to come here, baby.
Uh-oh.
I asked her to come here for just a moment, because the reason why I asked her to come here is because at some point that she and I, in order to be where we are, we had to allow our wave function to collapse into a point that it was perceptible by each of us. Now, if we simply violated that constraint and we said we're going to exist in the global wave of consciousness, we never find each other. Why? Because there's no locus for each of us to collapse upon.
Exactly.
Can I go back? In that corner now? Can I go back?
No, I was just.
She's asking to change her coordinates.
Yeah, exactly.
I just want to be in the background. I just want to stay in the background.
No, but here's the point that I'm getting at, and the reason why I asked you to come here is because at some point you and I had to agree to collapse our wave function as something that was findable, discoverable by each of us. If we had not done that and simply just said, okay, my energy, you've disabused yourself of self, I've disabused myself of self, that we do have this common energy, but is it discoverable? And that's the point.
I got you.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Now you can go back to your corner.
Thank you.
All right.
Can I just go open one more thing about this, because
Yeah.
the article talks about left brain, right brain function, and this is so funny. There is so much misunderstanding about left brain, right brain function, not just among pop culture and most people, but even there's so much outdated information that psychologists or researchers put into their article. When I read that article, I wonder about that specific experiment that they did that you talked about earlier. Were they mapping somehow what was actually happening in the brain when they said left brain function, right brain function?
Right.
Or were they using their own assumptions?
And when you look at the article, clearly it's assumptions.
That's what I think too.
Right.
So just to let people know, there's this guy, Ian McGilchrist, who's a neuroscience researcher who has devoted his entire life to studying left brain, right brain. And it's not as difficult to study as people think, because we know there's two hemispheres of the brain.
Yep.
And we know that they're connected through something called the corpus callosum, which is
Yep.
a little series of networks that allows the two to communicate to each other.
Yep.
And there are people who are either born without a corpus callosum, or there's a certain type of epilepsy that the treatment for it is to sever the corpus callosum.
Right.
So then these become very interesting people to study. And this is what blows me away about this article. And I'm having a hard time not getting upset at how irresponsibly information is shared. But you can Google this, right? There are people that have had this procedure done that have different selves. They have a right brain self and they have a left brain self. So to say that the self is a function of the left brain is so outrageously wrong.
No, listen, it's totally intellectually dishonest.
Yeah. Now, but
yeah.
So the whole, if I were reviewing that particular experiment, I'd say this is bullshit, because what they're saying in terms of participating in the overall study and like picking your favorite color or whatever, picking a color and then creating a story as to why you picked that color. Because the truth is, we're taught to believe that at the left side of the brain is language learning, linear logic, all that stuff, right? Right side of the brain is emotions, imagination,
creativity.
That's all bullshit. It's total bullshit.
Yeah.
Demonstrably bullshit. And what McGilchrist shows, and if anybody's interested and is nerdy like I am and wants to read a 600-page book, his book is called The Master and His Emissary. And what he shows in there is that the only difference between the right side and the left side is how they perceive something. And he says the right side perceives the whole, the body.
Yeah.
The left side perceives the individuated processes that take place in the body. So from a right brain perspective, I'm a body that's full of cells. From a left brain perspective, I have a heart. And we're going to go into the heart. The problem is the left brain without communicating with the right brain, does not have the ability to see the whole. So therefore the heart becomes the whole. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
So you can explain their answers based on how the questions invited them to perceive the actual experience.
Yeah.
Because if they tell them from a global perspective, they're perceiving it from a right hemisphere. If you get down to the nitty-gritty parts, what did you choose? Why did you choose that? Now you're using the left hemisphere.
Yep.
So I just had to go off on that because it drives me nuts that people who conduct experiments don't even know this stuff. It drives me crazy.
Well, watch this. There are experiments where people who have had grand mal epileptic seizures, right? And one of the things that's interesting about seizures, about grand mal seizures, is that they're almost exclusively localized in the right side of the brain. Almost exclusively. So what there have been experiments where they have had subjects where they have removed most of the right hemisphere of the brain. And what they found was that suddenly these same subjects became more creative. They became more poetic, more musically inclined, more artistically inclined. That somehow the left brain not only figured out how to do these things, but actually overcompensated.
Well, no, because that's still built on the premise that creativity comes from the right side of the brain. It does not.
It doesn't.
It does not.
It doesn't. Yeah.
And
but
so it's not compensating.
That's what we're taught, right?
It is, and it's a lie. It's a complete fabrication. It's just like this. Let me give you another one that drives me crazy. In communication, how many times have you sat in a training or maybe done trainings yourself? I did this. I'm not pointing the finger, but you said only 7% of what you communicate is verbal. 93% of it is nonverbal, or 11%, whatever the percentages are. 11% is verbal, 89% is nonverbal. It's facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, all that stuff, right?
Yep.
You know where that information originated from? It originated from a study done on how dogs communicate with human beings.
No shit.
Well, no shit. 93% of what they get is going to be your tone of voice and your body language because
Yeah,
they don't fucking speak English.
right.
There's never been any study that's been done on humans that validates that in any way, shape, or form. And it's very simple to prove to yourself because all you got to do is watch a series, watch a news program, take your pick, watch this program, and just turn the sound off. And then at the end of whatever you're watching with the sound off, I want you to give me 93% of what we talked about, or 89%, or 50%, or 30%.
Wow.
You can't do it.
You can't.
The vast majority of communication is what you say and how you say it.
Yeah.
It's not your body language. But see, that's another cultural myth that gets out there that it just becomes a meme that people believe and they accept as fact. It's like religion. And it's the same thing with this left brain, right brain stuff.
Yep.
It can be a helpful metaphor. I don't have any problem with that,
Yep.
But it's a metaphor. It's not real. Anyway, one of my pet peeves.
So anyway, let me say this, and this is like my closing statement.
Yeah.
Is that we exist as a locus.
Mm-hmm.
That we exist and we occupy a specific point in time. That there is a Cartesian coordinate of what is Derrick, of what is Aaron, and what is that? That is the self. That is the self. It is because watch this. If we say that there is no self, then that means that I'm totally dispensing of what are my desires, what are my hopes, my dreams. And the reality is, okay, so the authors of this article are saying that we're unhappy because we're trying to serve something that doesn't exist. Well, I disagree with that. That we do have a particular point. We do have a locus, that we do have coordinates, that we exist in some plane. And that when we say, okay, there is no I. There is no I. I think that at the best, we're doing ourselves a disservice, and at our worst, we're being deliberately intellectually dishonest.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think it's complete and utter nonsense to say that there is no self. But see, the reason, and the last thing I'll say,
Yep.
this is science trying to explain consciousness using the presuppositions of scientific materialism. And that's what I've been on about for the last year.
And that's something that you helped me on, because I was on the materialistic path, until you said, okay, have you thought about this? And so again, the self is something that there is no definitive scientific explanation for.
Yeah, well, consciousness in general, and again, I want to be sensitive to time, but you're sitting there drinking what I can only imagine is a very good Cabernet.
Oh my God, it's amazing.
Yeah. That part
Yeah.
cannot be scientifically quantified. Because there's people that think Cabernet is crap. Doesn't matter how good it is or how vintage it is. Why aren't you drinking a Pinot Grigio or a beer?
And yep.
So who's the self that's making those determinations? If there is no self, then how are there any determinations?
Right.
They can't measure that. I don't know what you experience. I know what I experience when I have a good cab. I don't know what you experience when you have a good cab unless you tell me. And then I'm totally dependent upon your self-reporting. I can't measure the experience. I can't quantify the experience. I can't put the experience in a laboratory.
Mm-hmm.
And so under the confines of scientific materialism, this article is trying to explain that. And they can't.
We can't.
They cannot.
Yep. I'm with you.
Because if it was just the
Let
brain,
me say this.
then we'd be the same. We'd have the same taste. We'd have, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, but reading it at its at a cursory level, immediately it thrusts me into a low key existential crisis because I'm
Of
like,
course.
okay, am I missing this whole self thing? Have I overemphasized this? Am I too reliant upon this? And so what happened was is I looked at this and I said, okay, no, there is no a disabusing of self. You can't do that. You cannot have a human experience and say and deny the self. You can't, because
No,
if you do this, basically so you talked about materialism. You're reducing yourself to a materialistic object that only exists with some logical. Uh,
yes.
right. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So, and this is why, okay, let me just say this, and this is my third closing. I'm being a good Baptist preacher or Pentecostal
We're being
or
straight
faith
Baptist.
preacher or whatever you want to call it. Um, this is why I have such a visceral reaction to this, because you're sitting here telling me I did a cursory reading of this and there are good elements and principles in it. I am acknowledging that.
Yep.
But the premise is bullshit to me. But
Yep.
watch this. You're saying I'm reading this and I'm having a low-key existential crisis. My friend, that is not necessarily a good thing. Now, if you're just reading it at a cursory level and having an existential crisis, imagine people that are indoctrinated into this.
Mhm.
New Age teaching, Eastern religion, Eastern philosophy.
Yep.
What kind of an existential crisis does that create? What kind of a problem does that create?
Yeah.
So it's so powerful, these ideas, that just a brief reading, someone like you has a very strong sense of self and very actualized. I would call you a very, self-actualized individual. And you're like, I'm in a crisis. Well, what about someone who isn't? Who
But
doesn't have
here's
this?
the thing.
You see what I'm saying?
That's why I nuanced it by saying low key.
Yeah,
Right?
no, I know. But what I'm saying is, imagine, for you, it's low key. And what I'm saying is, imagine someone who doesn't have that, or someone who is totally indoctrinated into it.
Wow. Yeah.
It's dangerous, in my opinion.
No, I mean, totally. I get it, because if you're not rooted and grounded, so there's a biblical verse that talks about being tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine,
Right.
right? And that's this, that if you are not rooted and grounded. So again, when I said low key, I was like, okay, this made me think of something that I hadn't considered before, and that was the low key and existential crisis. But I understand that I know who I am,
Right.
and so that part wasn't upset by this.
Right.
But the whole concept of from a global standpoint of whether or not the self doesn't exist, I'm like, whoa, wait a second. That was deep. That was powerful, and that's why I shared it with you, because this was something that, and again, this is my whole thing as far as spirituality, as far as like consciousness is concerned. I don't have all the answers. Never purport to. But what I will say is, either you're thinking about, what you're thinking about. In other words, meta thinking, right? Or you're not. And what I mean by that is that I think that most people go through life without actually thinking about what they think about. In other
Yeah.
words, they have applied no meta to their thinking or no meta to their believing. And so they just believe something or think something because this is what I've been taught. And so my challenge to everybody that's watching this, everybody that's listening, is that you need to apply the meta to whatever it is that you think or believe. Because if you just read this at face value, and again, I said to you, Aaron, this is a low key existential crisis. Then that means that this caused me to really think about my existence. But did it ultimately reframe my existence? No, because I'm rooted and grounded in what I know
Oh
or
yeah,
what I believe to be true.
for sure. And I know that. I know that. The point I was trying to make was for people who don't, this can be very dangerous.
It
It
can
can
be.
lead to a lot of abuse.
Yep.
And
Absolutely.
and that's the only point I was making there. Um, yeah, good stuff, man. I
Yeah.
love. Let me just say this: I love that you think about your thinking. I love that you're not so entrenched into one way of thinking that when presented with new information, you're very open to new information. For me, this is something that I have poured through
Yep.
for the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. So
Yep.
I had read that article actually at some point in time. So it's just a different perspective because I'm trying to figure out that came from an existential crisis, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, I think it was good. I hope it was helpful for people. Um, and I know there's lots of people that probably, affirm that type of teaching. I just don't. I don't at all affirm that. But I do think this is good. And last thing I'll say, final close. It's good to realize that it's not concrete or settled or fixed because in Western psychology, we were told that your sense of self is set by age of 7 or something.
Yep.
And any hope of changing that you have, that self, like we made it that concrete, right? So the truth is somewhere in the middle. Like over here in the East, they're saying there is no self. And over here in the West, we're saying it's so concrete that it's settled at 7 years old and whatever happened to you and whatever your parents did to you and whatever it's settled and you can't fix it and you can't change it. And we know that's not true. And
Yep.
so I think it's helpful to understand you're not dealing with something that's fixed and settled and concrete. You can change anything you want about yourself because it's that plastic, but it's still going to be a new version of you. You can't get away from the self,
Right.
but you can absolutely change the self.
Right. You can alter yourself, but you can't eliminate yourself.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes. I think that's the message of the show.
That's
Good
the
place.
message of the show. That absolutely is it. Dude, you know something, Aaron? I say this sometimes, but I say this very emphatically. This may be the best show that we've ever done.
It was a good one for sure. It was a good one for sure. I love
Yeah.
how you put that at the end. You can alter the self, but you can't, how'd you say, escape the self or whatever. I don't
You
remember.
can't escape the self.
I love it.
You are what you are. You are who you are. So,
All right, brother. Another great show. I agree completely.
all right, bro. Man, I love you. And
Love
thanks all for attending our TED Talk tonight.
Yeah, I have a new closing. I saw this Gen X thing. I
Okay.
just want to let everybody who signed my seventh grade yearbook to know that I stayed cool. So stay cool out there, everybody.
Be cool, motherfuckers. Oh, wait a minute. Look at that, man. It brought all the confetti and shit. That was cool. Yeah, but bro, man, thank you for everything, man. I love you.
Love you, man. Very much.
You are my hero.
Right on.
Serious.
You too. You too, man.
All right.
Love you. All right.
All right, y'all take care. Everybody, thanks for watching. Have a great weekend. Like and subscribe.
Yes. Like and subscribe. Hit the buttons.
Yep. All right, Aaron. I'll talk with you later, bro.
All right.